Beneath the grandeur of the Ottoman Empire lies a horrifying secret, one that no history book dares to fully expose. Children, ripped from their homes, their lives forever shattered, to become pawns in a game of power. The devshirme system, a practice so dark it stains the very fabric of history, took its toll on countless souls. What happened to those boys? And who truly paid the price for the rise of an empire? In the silence of the past, the truth waits to be uncovered. The empire's rise was not without its dark costs, buried beneath the towering palaces and resplendent battlefields that told stories of victory. The truth, however, was more sinister. It was built on the backs of those who had no voice, no power, no choice. Imagine a world where your child is stolen from you, taken from the warmth of their home, the safety of their mother's arms, ripped away to serve an empire's hunger for power. This is not a tale of legends or distant myths. This was the harsh reality of the Ottoman Empire. The devshirme system, the practice that underpinned its military might, was a mechanism of cruelty disguised as necessity. Boys, innocent and young, were torn from their families, pulled from their villages, and transported to the heart of the empire. There, in Istanbul's darkened streets and towering palaces, their lives were reshaped into something unrecognizable. They were not soldiers at first. They were children, broken by the weight of an empire's demands. The devshirme was a blood harvest, an annual event that saw families lose their sons in exchange for an empire's expansion. But this was not a simple act of tribute or conscription. It was a systemic, calculated dismantling of lives. The toll on the families was immeasurable, yet their grief went unheard, their suffering unnoticed. In the grand narrative of the empire's glory, these children were but a footnote. Their story, however, is where the true cost of empire begins. These children, some as young as 8, were thrown into a world they never chose, a life they never imagined. They were stripped of their identities, their heritage, their families. In their place, they were given new names, new cultures, new beliefs. They became part of the machinery, the very lifeblood of an empire that would stop at nothing to expand its dominion. Yet, behind every victory, there was a child, lost, whose pain was woven into the fabric of imperial conquest. The boys, whose futures were stolen, were molded into warriors, into servants, into instruments of war. Their humanity was stripped away, replaced with discipline, loyalty, and power. But at what cost? This cost was not measured in gold or territory, but in the shattered lives of those who had no voice in their fate. It was a sacrifice made in silence for an empire that demanded the unthinkable. And in the corridors of power, as the empire thrived, the cries of these stolen children were drowned out. Their legacy, like shadows in the fog, remains hidden, untouched by time, but never forgotten. What does it mean to rise to power at such a cost? Can the legacy of an empire built on human suffering ever truly be justified? The echoes of those who were lost call to us, urging us to uncover the truth, to ask the questions left unanswered for centuries. The hidden cost of empire is not just measured in battles won or lands claimed, but in the lives shattered, the children stolen. The first harvest was not a gathering of crops or riches, but the ruthless taking of children, innocent boys plucked from their homes like ripe fruit in the night. It was an annual event, the devshirme system's cruelest ritual, a practice hidden behind the curtains of the empire's grandeur. In the silence of the villages, families went to bed unaware that their sons would not wake in the morning, would not see their mothers' faces again, nor play in the fields with their siblings. The moment was swift, a violent rupture that shattered families in an instant. The Sultan's soldiers, masked and impassive, would arrive, walking into the peaceful lives of farmers and merchants, carrying with them the weight of fate. The children, often no older than 8, were herded into carts like cattle, taken far from the places they had known, their future written by the empire's unyielding hand. Some went without a struggle, too young to fully understand what was happening, their confusion evident in the wide eyes of the innocent. But others fought, clawing for a life they had not chosen, desperate for the family they were torn from. It didn't matter. The empire's grip was firm, and in the cold shadow of power, resistance meant nothing. The boys, once full of life, were now faces in a sea of strangers, no longer children, no longer sons. Their stories were erased, their names no longer belonging to them. Instead, they would be remade, reshaped into weapons, servants, soldiers for the empire's endless hunger. In those early days, many of the boys didn't understand what was happening to them, why they were being separated from their home. All they knew was the fear, the terror of separation, of being dragged into an unknown future. The cries of mothers were carried away by the winds, unheard and ignored. The boys were treated as tools, their humanity reduced to the utility they could offer an empire that saw them not as people, but as instruments of power. The journey to Istanbul was long, grueling, and heart-wrenching. The boys, stripped of their identities, had no choice but to submit to the fate that awaited them. Some never spoke again, their spirits broken by the cruelty of it all. Others tried to hold on to whatever memories they could, clinging to the fading images of their homes and families. But these were fleeting thoughts, soon to be replaced by the harsh reality of life in the empire. It wasn't just a physical journey. It was a journey into a new world, one where the boys would learn that their lives were no longer their own. As they arrived in the heart of the empire, there was no welcoming committee, no safety net. They were ushered into a world that would erase their pasts, forcing them to become something new, something unrecognizable. The first harvest was not a harvest of crops, but of lives ruthlessly claimed and brutally transformed. And in this act, the empire's grip tightened, its power secured not in the lands it conquered, but in the souls it controlled. This was the cost of empire. The road to Istanbul was long, filled with the sound of metal wheels scraping against worn cobblestones and the hollow, distant cries of children who had been taken from everything they knew. The boys, many of them barely old enough to walk without stumbling, were herded in groups, shackled together like cattle. The carts they were forced to ride in creaked under the weight of their innocence lost, their small bodies packed tightly, their eyes wide with fear, confusion, and a deep, aching sorrow. This journey, so far from their homes and families, would not just be a physical passage. It was the death of their former selves, the birth of something new, something forged in the heart of an empire. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, dust, and the fear that clung to them like a second skin. Some cried for their mothers, their voices desperate and high-pitched, but it did nothing to ease the burden of their fate. Others were too numb to speak, staring blankly ahead, their minds already shutting down to protect them from the horror of what was happening. They had no way of knowing where they were going, only that they were being taken further and further from their homes, further from the lives they had known. For days, the boys were forced to march, their feet bleeding from the harshness of the terrain, their bodies weakening under the brutal march. The guards that accompanied them cared little for their suffering. They were a means to an end, mere cargo to be delivered. The journey was grueling, exhausting, and in many ways, it mirrored the journey of their souls, the slow, painful erosion of their identities, piece by piece, until nothing of who they once were remained. At night, as they rested in makeshift camps, the silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the occasional sob of a boy whose grief had not yet subsided, or the low murmur of frightened whispers. It was during these moments that the weight of what was happening began to sink in. The boys no longer had any hope of returning home. They would never again see their mothers, their fathers, their villages. Istanbul loomed ahead, the center of the empire, a place of unknown horrors and dark promises. What awaited them there was even worse than the journey they had just endured. As the days turned into weeks, their hope began to fade, replaced by a cold realization they were no longer children of their villages. They were becoming something else. They were becoming tools of an empire that would shape them, control them, and, in the end, erase them. In the shadows of that march, the road to Istanbul was more than just a path to a city. It was a one-way street into oblivion, where the souls of the boys would be transformed, crushed, and remade in the empire's image. And in the eyes of the boys, the light of hope flickered, dimming with every step they took towards the city of stone and power, towards a fate they could not escape. The boys, once so full of life, arrived at the heart of the empire, a place they could never have imagined in their wildest nightmares. Istanbul, a city of grandeur and mystery, lay before them like an imposing fortress, its walls hiding both power and cruelty. It was a world so different from the humble villages they had known. The city's towering structures and bustling streets overwhelmed them, but the sense of awe quickly faded as they were ushered into the imperial court, where their transformation would truly begin. They were no longer children, no longer the sons of farmers, craftsmen, or merchants. Here, they were stripped of their names and identities, their pasts erased like chalk from a board. In the place of their familiar lives, they were given new names, names that belonged to the empire, to its soldiers, its servants, and its power. The boys were divided into groups, each destined for a different life within the imperial structure. Some would be molded into soldiers, part of the elite Janissary corps, while others would serve in the Sultan's court, trained to become personal attendants, guards, or even spies. Every part of their former selves was removed, replaced by the cold machinery of empire. They were no longer children. They were tools, instruments of war and power, forged by an empire that cared nothing for their humanity. The physical and emotional punishment began almost immediately. The training was brutal both in body and spirit. Their childhood innocence was stripped away in the harshest of ways. Those chosen for the Janissaries were subjected to grueling physical conditioning, forced to endure endless drills and exercises that left their bodies aching, their muscles burning. They were made to fight, to kill, to obey without question. Their childhoods, those fleeting years of joy, of running through fields, of playing with friends, were gone forever. Those who remained in the court fared no better. They were given little time to adjust to their new lives. Instead, they were trained to serve the whims of the Sultan, to become shadows of power, silent and obedient. Every word they spoke, every gesture they made, was controlled. They were taught to forget their families, to erase their former lives, and to exist only to serve. In the grand halls of the palace, where silk curtains fluttered in the breeze and the scent of incense filled the air, the boys were nothing more than servants to the empire's unyielding hunger. Their lives were no longer their own, and as they were stripped of their names and cultures, a sense of grief, heavy and suffocating, began to settle deep within them. They would never return home, never see their families again. Their new life was now their prison, and the weight of that truth was suffocating. In the silence of the imperial court, where echoes of the past were lost to time, these boys were transformed into shadows of their former selves, remnants of a family, a culture, a life that would never be reclaimed. It was here, in the cold heart of the empire, that their true transformation began, a transformation that would leave them unrecognizable. And in the dark corners of their hearts, as the years passed, the question lingered: who were they now? The transformation began the moment the boys stepped onto the cold, stone floors of the imperial palace, their old selves beginning to slip away with every passing second. They were no longer the children who had once played in the sun, chasing dreams beneath the skies of their villages. The palace, with its grand, imposing walls and eerie silence, was a prison for their identities. In the hands of the empire, they would be remade not just physically, but mentally, spiritually. Their names were stripped from them, their language forced to change, their beliefs and customs replaced by those of the empire. The once bright-eyed boys were quickly molded into something different, something unrecognizable. The physical training was the first blow to their former selves, brutal and unrelenting. Those selected for the Janissary Corps were thrust into endless drills, their bodies pushed to the brink of exhaustion. Their muscles screamed, their bones ached, but there was no rest, no mercy. Every movement, every breath, had to be precise, controlled. There was no room for weakness, no time for pain. The soldiers were taught not to think, but to obey. Their lives were now dedicated to one singular purpose: to serve the Sultan's will. The boys who remained in the palace were not spared from the transformation. Their training was different, more insidious. They were taught the art of servitude, drilled on how to move silently, how to stand without a word, how to anticipate the Sultan's every need. Every action had to be swift, flawless, without hesitation. They were no longer humans with desires, fears, or hopes. They were instruments, shaped by the hand of the empire, to serve at its command. In their eyes, a deep sense of loss began to take root, but they dared not show it. Emotion was weakness, and weakness was unacceptable. They were taught to suppress their sorrow, their fear, their longing for home. Slowly, Their memories of the world they had come from began to fade, as if each passing day was another nail in the coffin of their old selves. The boys, once full of life, became shadows of what they once were. The transformation was not just in their bodies, though it was in their minds as well. The constant pressure to conform, to become the perfect soldier or servant, warped their very perception of who they were. What did it mean to be human when everything that had once defined them was stripped away? The Empire offered them no answers, only obedience, only servitude. And yet, despite the brutal training, despite the relentless molding of their minds and bodies, some of the boys still clung to the faintest glimmer of who they had been. Their hearts, though battered, still beat with memories of the families they had lost, of the lives they had once known. But those memories were becoming like ghosts, faint whispers in the dark, easily dismissed by the Empire's powerful grip. The transformation, however, was far from complete. It would take years, decades, perhaps, for the boys to become the very thing the Empire needed them to be. But with every moment that passed, they drifted further from the people they once were, until they could no longer recognize the reflection staring back at them. They had become something new, something that would never return to the world they once knew. The dark history of the Devshirm system raises questions about the cost of empire and human exploitation. Discover the untold stories of the children who were stolen, and learn about the long-lasting effects of the Empire's hunger for power. Don't let their stories remain in silence. Subscribe now to uncover more of history's hidden truths, and join us as we explore the forgotten corners of the past. For those who were chosen, the path ahead was even more brutal, more demanding, and more isolating than anything they had already endured. The elite forces of the Ottoman Empire, the Janissaries, stood at the pinnacle of power and respect, but the price for entry was higher than any of them could have imagined. These boys, now hardened by the unrelenting discipline of the imperial court, were selected to become the Sultan's most trusted warriors, yet they had no say in their fate. They were stripped once again, this time not of their names but of their very humanity. The Janissaries were more than soldiers. They were instruments of war, tools of an empire that demanded absolute loyalty and unwavering obedience. The transformation was more than physical. It was a complete remaking of their very identity. They were trained not just to fight, but to become symbols of the Sultan's will, cold, merciless, unstoppable. The years of brutal drills and constant testing took their toll. But for those who endured, the reward was power, the power to wield death, to strike fear into the hearts of enemies, and to serve the Empire in ways that few could understand. But this power came at a great cost. The boys, now grown men, were no longer capable of thinking as individuals. Their lives were entirely controlled by the Empire's will. Every action, every step they took, was dictated by the Sultan's orders. They were taught not to question, not to feel, not to remember. The names of their families, the faces of their mothers and fathers, were mere ghosts in their minds, fading with every passing year. They had become more than soldiers. They had become tools, forged in the heart of the Empire. And in the heat of battle, as they charged into the fray with swords raised high, they no longer saw the enemy as men. They saw them as obstacles to be removed, threats to the Empire that had claimed them. The bond they shared with the other Janissaries was strong, a bond forged in suffering and hardship, but it was also a bond of control. They were not brothers in arms. They were extensions of the Sultan's will. The battlefield was their home, the place where they were truly alive, but the cost of this life was immense. They had no lives beyond it, no futures beyond the Empire's need for their blood. Each battle they fought took a piece of their soul. Each victory further eroded the men they had once been. The Janissaries had become legends, but these were not legends of freedom or heroism. They were legends of subjugation, of men who had no choice but to serve, who had no lives outside the Empire's grasp. Yet, within the heart of the Janissary, a quiet, unspoken question lingered. What would it be like to be free? This was a question that none dared speak, for freedom was something they could never know, not as long as the Empire's hand gripped their lives so tightly. The Janissaries, once innocent boys plucked from their villages, now marched as an unstoppable force, the heartbeat of the Empire's war machine. They were no longer individuals, no longer children of lost homes. They were the Empire's tools. forged through years of grueling training and ruthless discipline. When the call for war came, the Janissaries answered without hesitation. Their bodies trained to move as one, their minds sharpened to follow the Sultan's every command without question. The battlefield was no longer a place of fear. It had become their home, their purpose, their entire existence. The drums of war echoed through the land, and as the Janissaries lined up, their armor clanking, their swords raised, they knew no loyalty but to the empire. They fought not for their families, not for their homeland, but for the Sultan who had stolen their childhoods and reshaped them into the instruments of his power. The first time they set foot on the battlefield, their hearts did not race with fear. There was no room for fear in the heart of a Janissary. They fought with precision, with cold calculation, each movement an extension of the empire's will. It was not about victory for them, but about survival, about fulfilling the purpose they had been molded to serve. As they clashed with enemy forces, the Janissaries moved as a single, merciless machine. No hesitation, no mercy, no humanity. They were warriors, yes, but they were also slaves to the empire, forced to kill and die for a cause they had never chosen. Each strike, each battle won, added another layer to the wall of numbness that surrounded their souls. The faces of those they killed blurred into a single mass, for they had no names, no identities, just obstacles in the way of the empire's unstoppable advance. For the Janissaries, there was no longer any sense of self, just the mission, to fight, to conquer, to ensure the empire's dominion. But even in the heat of battle, the question lingered echoing in the recesses of their minds. What are we fighting for? It was a question that could not be answered. For it was a question that could not be asked. To ask was to show weakness, and weakness was unacceptable. So, they fought, and they killed, and they watched as the empire grew, all the while giving up pieces of themselves, slowly losing whatever humanity remained within. The blood of their enemies stained their hands, but the blood of their own lost innocence stained their hearts. The empire did not see them as men. It saw them as tools, expendable instruments that could be replaced as easily as a sword could be forged. And so, the Janissaries moved forward, their hearts hardened, their minds trained to shut out the whispers of their past, to shut out the longing for freedom they would never know. They were the war machine, the empire's might, and in their eyes burned only the cold, steady flame of duty. Loyalty, once a simple bond between family and home, had become a suffocating chain for the Janissaries. Their allegiance now belonged not to the people they had once loved, but to the Sultan, to the empire that had shaped them, broken them, and remade them. With each battle they fought, with each victory they claimed, the weight of their loyalty pressed deeper into their souls, leaving them further detached from the world they had been stolen from. They were no longer free men. They were the empire's shadows, bound by an unspoken oath that demanded total devotion, total sacrifice. The cost of this loyalty was immense, yet the Janissaries could not escape its grip. It was not loyalty born from love or choice. It was loyalty born from the empire's power, forged in the furnace of fear and obedience. The Janissaries fought not for glory, not for honor, but for the continued survival of the empire that had claimed their lives. And in the quiet moments between battles, when the sounds of war had faded and the blood had been washed away, a quiet desperation settled over them. What had they become? Once they had been children, full of dreams and hopes, with futures of their own to shape. Now, they were ghosts, walking through life without a past, without a future. Their loyalty to the empire had cost them everything: their family, their childhood, their very selves. Some of them, deep in the recesses of their minds, still questioned their purpose, still wondered whether this sacrifice was worth it. But such questions were dangerous, for the empire had no room for doubt, no room for hesitation. To question was to show weakness, and weakness meant death. So they remained silent, locking away their thoughts, burying their doubts beneath the ironclad walls of loyalty. The Janissaries were proud of their strength, of their discipline, but in the quiet moments, when they allowed themselves to reflect, the cost of that loyalty became undeniable. Their loyalty to the empire had stripped them of their humanity, replacing their dreams with endless commands, their identities with the cold face of obedience. They had given everything to the empire, and what had they received in return? Power? Yes, they had power, but at the cost of everything that had made them who they were. The empire had molded them into soldiers, into weapons of war. And in doing so, it had taken everything from them. They were no longer men. They were instruments, tools to be wielded, broken, and replaced. And as the years passed, and the empire's demands grew ever greater, the Janissaries began to realize the truth. Their loyalty had not been to something greater. It had been a betrayal of the very people they once were. They had given up their lives, their hearts, their souls, and for what? To be forgotten by history, to be used up and discarded when their usefulness had ended. Loyalty had cost them everything. The empire's need for control was not born out of fear alone. It was a hunger, a relentless thirst to shape the world in its image, and nothing symbolized that more than the Devshirme system. The boys who were taken from their villages were not just fodder for the empire's war machine. They were living symbols of its absolute power. The empire's true strength was not in its armies, its wealth, or its conquests. No, its power lay in its ability to manipulate and control the lives of those who had no choice but to submit. The boys, once taken, were cut off from everything they had known. Their names were erased, their identities wiped clean, and their futures were bound to the empire's will. This was the empire's genius and its cruelty in equal measure. By severing their ties to their families, their cultures, and their homelands, the empire ensured that they would remain loyal, not out of love, but because there was no one left to return to. The boys were trained not just to be soldiers, but to be extensions of the empire itself. Their thoughts, their actions, their very sense of self were molded by the empire's demands. It was a system that forced them to forget the lives they had lost, and to replace them with a singular purpose: to serve. The empire controlled them in ways deeper than mere obedience. It erased their individuality, turning them into mere instruments, each one a cog in the vast, intricate machine of empire building. In the imperial court, the boys were taught to suppress any trace of emotion, any spark of rebellion. There was no room for the softness of childhood, no space for the fleeting desires of young men. The empire's control was absolute, and any hint of resistance was met with swift punishment. To question was to betray, and betrayal could cost them everything. The empire understood that loyalty could not be demanded. It had to be engineered. By stripping away the very fabric of a person's identity, the empire ensured that there would be no room for loyalty to anything but itself. The boys, once proud sons of their villages, now found themselves lost in a world where nothing was theirs. Their loyalty belonged only to the empire, for it was all they had left. The empire needed control, and it needed the boys to forget who they were, to strip away every last piece of their past until there was nothing left but the cold, unquestioning loyalty that would keep them in line. This was how the empire built its strength, not through the blood of its enemies, but through the blood of its own stolen children. The cost of this control was not just the loss of individual lives, it was the loss of entire identities, entire cultures, wiped away to create an empire that existed not in the real world, but in the minds of those it had shaped. The silent legacy of the Devshirme system haunted the boys, long after their bodies were hardened, long after their names had been erased. It was a legacy written in the depths of their minds, in the very fibers of their being, though it went unnoticed by the world. To the empire, they were simply tools, weapons forged for its expansion, its conquest. But to the boys, now men, now Janissaries, the legacy was something more. It was the deep, aching void that grew within them, a space where their pasts once lived, now hollow and empty. No one ever asked about their lives before the empire took them. No one cared. Their families were gone, their villages forgotten, their very identities erased. The men they had become knew nothing of the boys they had once been. There were no monuments built for them, no statues erected in their honor. The empire saw only the soldier, the servant, the loyal tool. But beneath the armor, beneath the sharp blades and cold stares, the Janissaries carried their silent legacy with them. Each step heavy, with the knowledge that their entire existence had been forged in the fire of empire and loss. They were not men who had made a choice. They were men who had been chosen for purposes they had never consented to. And yet, in the quiet moments when they sat alone, the memories of what had been stolen from them began to resurface like ghosts, whispers of mothers' voices, of the warmth of their childhood homes, of lives they would never know. It was not just their families that had been taken from them, but the very essence of their humanity. The Janissaries, powerful as they were, carried the weight of what they had lost, yet no one saw it. The Empire had created them, but it had also destroyed them. In their silence, they spoke volumes. Their very existence, a reminder of a cost paid in stolen lives, in forgotten names. Their loyalty to the Empire was unspoken, but so was their grief, buried deep within them. No one could see the toll it took to serve, to fight for an empire that gave nothing back. There were no apologies, no acknowledgments of the lives they had sacrificed. The silent legacy lived on in the eyes of the Janissaries, in the way they carried themselves, in the cold detachment they wore like a second skin. It was a legacy built on fear, on loss, on sacrifice. And while the empire thrived, its stolen children were left behind, forgotten by history, their legacy not written in the annals of time but etched into the deepest parts of their souls. The empire had claimed their names, but it could never take their memories, memories that would remain silent but ever present, within the men who had once been boys, now warriors of a cruel and unforgiving empire. The Janissaries, once mere boys stolen from their homes, had become legends in their own right, symbols of the empire's unrivaled power, yet also embodiments of its cold, calculating cruelty. Their status was mythic, almost otherworldly, as if they were not men, but the very instruments of fate itself. To the outside world, the Janissaries were feared, respected, and revered. Their discipline, their strength, their loyalty to the Sultan made them the most formidable military force in the empire, an unstoppable force that struck fear into the hearts of all who stood in their way. But beneath this mythic exterior lay something darker, something far more human. They were not born warriors, but created ones. Their identities forged in the fires of an empire that took everything from them. The Janissaries were not just soldiers. They were the empire's soul, its unflinching arm, its might. Their mythic status was built not on their prowess in battle alone, but on the fear they inspired. When they marched into a city, it wasn't just their strength that was felt. It was the weight of history, the silence of countless stolen lives, the hollow promise of loyalty bought with the blood of their own youth. The empire had made them into instruments of fear and power, but it had also stripped them of any hope of return, any hope of freedom. Their mythic status was not something they could escape. It was a mask they wore, a role they were forced to play, and in playing that role, they lost themselves even further. The Janissaries had become the embodiment of the empire's will, unyielding and unrepentant, their lives defined not by choice, but by the demands of a distant ruler who had long since erased their identities. Their power, their reputation, was built on the backs of those who had once been children, and yet the empire cared little for the price it had paid. The Janissaries wore their mythic status with pride, yes, but also with a deep, aching sorrow that no one could see. They were men who had never chosen their fate, men who had been forced to become something they never wanted to be. And so, the empire thrived. Its military might carried on the shoulders of the Janissaries, men who had become legends, yes, but at the cost of everything that made them human. They were both gods and ghosts in the eyes of the empire, walking the thin line between reverence and fear, their mythic status both a blessing and a curse. The Janissaries, in their silent power, held the empire's soul in their hands. But at what cost? What price did they pay for the empire's success? And who would ever hear their story, buried beneath the myth of what they had become? For all their mythic status, for all the fear they inspired, the Janissaries were not immune to the deep, gnawing ache of rebellion that simmered beneath the surface of their disciplined lives. For years, they had been molded, shaped, and broken by the empire, taught to suppress every emotion, every thought that might lead them to question the life they had been forced to live. But beneath their cold exteriors, beneath the ironclad loyalty to the Sultan, the seed of resistance began to take root. It was subtle at first, a quiet whisper in the dark corners of their barracks, a fleeting thought in the midst of another brutal battle. But as the years wore on, the Empire's grip on them, tight as it was, began to falter. The Janissaries, once the epitome of obedience, began to remember, or perhaps imagine, what it was like to have a choice. They began to look at each other with different eyes, eyes that saw more than soldiers, more than tools of war. The idea of rebellion, of resistance, took hold not in the form of open revolt, but in the quiet, defiant acts of solidarity. Some began to slow their drills, to murmur in hushed voices of a life beyond the Empire's reach. Others began to secretly question the Empire's demands, asking themselves what they had truly gained in all their years of service. The Empire had promised them power, respect, and honor. What had it given them instead? A lifetime of servitude. A lifetime spent in the shadow of a ruler who had stolen their youth, who had erased their pasts and shaped their futures without their consent. It wasn't that they wanted to overthrow the Empire. No, the idea of true rebellion, of standing against the might of the Sultan, was as terrifying as it was impossible. But the whispers, the small acts of resistance, grew louder. Some of the Janissaries began to fight with less fury in their hearts, their swords still sharp, but their wills softened by doubt. They no longer sought to strike fear into the hearts of their enemies. Instead, they began to wonder whether their enemies were, in fact, the ones they had once been. Others sought small rebellions, stealing moments of freedom when they could, perhaps a glimpse of the horizon, a taste of air that wasn't filled with the smell of blood and death. These acts of resistance, though minor in the grand scheme of things, began to erode the Janissaries' ironclad devotion to the Empire. And though none of them would openly speak of it, a quiet, shared rebellion began to take root in their hearts, not against the Sultan, but against the Empire that had stripped them of everything they had once been. Their rebellion was not one of swords and fire, but of memory, of reclaiming the fragments of their lost lives, of remembering what it meant to be human again. They had been broken, remade into something unrecognizable. But in the silence of their resistance, they began to find the fragments of the boys they had once been. The cycle of power within the Empire was relentless, a never-ending wheel that turned with the force of centuries, powered by the very lives of those it consumed. The Janissaries, those once innocent boys, had long ceased to be individuals, no longer sons or brothers but mere cogs in the grand machine of the Empire. Each generation of children stolen and remade into soldiers was merely a new link in the chain, a fresh set of bodies to serve the Empire's insatiable hunger for dominance. And yet, despite their fierce loyalty and their brutal training, the cycle of power that had created them was always poised to swallow them whole. Every year, more children were taken, more futures were erased, and the Empire's hold over its people tightened. The Janissaries, who had once been nothing but stolen boys, now found themselves in a cruel paradox. They had become the very instruments of the Empire's power, but in doing so, they had lost themselves completely. There was no going back. Their lives were no longer theirs to shape. Every campaign, every conquest, every bloody battle won only served to reinforce the cycle, ensuring that new generations of children would follow in their footsteps, just as they had once followed the orders of their commanders. The Empire's hunger for power could never be sated, for it was not just land or wealth it craved. It was control complete, unyielding control over every soul it touched. The Janissaries, as proud and powerful as they were, had become a part of that insidious cycle, their strength feeding the very force that had destroyed their humanity. The Empire never stopped. It never paused to reflect on the cost of its victories, the price of its expansions. The power it gained came at the expense of everything that had ever been real, of the villages, the families, the lives that had been lost. And so, as the Janissaries fought for the Empire, they did so not only for the Sultan but for the perpetuation of this vicious cycle. They fought so that more boys would be taken, more lives would be erased, more identities would be obliterated. It was a cycle that could not be broken, not by the men who fought in it, not by the children who would eventually join it, for the Empire's power was too great, its reach too long, its demand too absolute. The Janissaries, though they had once been human, were now nothing more than extensions of that power. They had become the cycle itself, its strength, its silence, its endless motion. And with each passing year, as more boys were taken, more memories erased, the empire's hold only deepened. The cycle of power continued, as it always had, and the empire's grip grew tighter with every stolen life, every broken soul. The end of an era came not with the clang of swords or the roar of battle, but with the quiet, unsettling shift of power that echoed through the empire's walls. The Janissaries, once the heart of the empire's military might, had grown old, their numbers thinning, their once unyielding strength slowly fading. They had fought countless wars, bled on foreign soils, and expanded the empire beyond its wildest dreams. Yet, as the years wore on, the empire's grip on its most loyal soldiers began to slip. The Sultan's once absolute rule wavered, the Janissaries began to question their role, and the empire that had forged them into weapons now found itself facing the bitter consequences of its own creation. The Janissaries, who had long been the empire's backbone, were no longer content to serve without question. Their loyalty, once ironclad, had begun to fracture. The sense of identity they had lost in their youth, the pieces of themselves buried deep beneath layers of power and control, began to stir. They were no longer content to be tools, to be forgotten after their usefulness had been spent. As their numbers dwindled, whispers of rebellion filled the air. These whispers, once faint, grew louder. The men who had once fought with unwavering devotion now questioned everything, their pasts, their purpose, and the empire that had stolen both. Their power had been stripped from them, replaced with a hollow loyalty to a sultan who cared little for the lives of those who had fought and bled for his throne. The empire that had raised them, that had forged them from the ashes of their childhoods, now seemed to offer nothing but abandonment. The Janissaries began to resist, not with swords and shields, but with defiance, with voices raised in protest. The very soldiers who had once upheld the empire's glory were now questioning its very foundation. The end of the era was inevitable, for empires cannot last forever, and the empire that had been built on the broken bodies of stolen children was no exception. As the Janissaries grew restless, the old empire began to crumble. The foundation of power that had once been so unshakable now trembled, weakened by the very force that had once upheld it. The once mythic status of the Janissaries, the very soldiers who had expanded the empire's borders, now seemed like a distant memory, a legacy tainted by the blood and pain that had fueled it. The rebellion, though not immediate or overt, had already begun in the hearts of those who had been taken, shaped, and broken. They had endured the empire's reign for so long, but the price they had paid was too great. They were no longer willing to be forgotten, no longer willing to be the silent weapons of a distant ruler. The end of an era had come, and with it, the slow, painful realization that the empire built on their backs would soon falter, its walls crumbling, its soldiers turning away. The forgotten souls of the empire drifted through history, their names erased, their lives obscured by the weight of time and power. The Janissaries, once the pride of the empire, had become mere shadows in the annals of history, their true stories buried beneath layers of myth and legend. Those who had once been stolen from their homes, their identities lost to the empire's insatiable need for control, had faded from memory. No statues stood in their honor. No monuments were built to remember the lives that had been sacrificed. The empire had taken their names, their childhoods, and in the end, it had taken their very humanity. They were soldiers, warriors, and servants, never more than tools to be used and discarded when their usefulness was over. And yet, deep within the silent corners of their souls, they remained. They were the ones who had been forgotten, not by their families who had never known what had happened to them, but by the empire that had claimed them. Their lives, which had once been full of potential and promise, had been reduced to mere footnotes in the empire's rise and fall. The boys, who had been taken so many years ago, had lived lives of servitude and war, never knowing what it meant to be truly free, never knowing what it felt like to return to the homes and families they had lost. The empire had erased them, not just from history, but from their own hearts. Their memories were buried beneath the weight of their training, their loyalty, their duty to an empire that saw them as nothing more than instruments of war. They had given everything to the empire: blood, sweat, and tears, but the empire had never given anything back. When they were no longer useful, they were discarded, their names forgotten, their contributions erased. They had served their purpose, and now they were gone. Their stories, like their identities, were lost to time, never to be told. It was as if they had never existed at all. And yet, even in their silence, even in their absence, the Janissaries remained. The empire had created them, and the empire had destroyed them. But the truth of who they had been, what they had lost, could never be fully erased. It lived on in the shadows, in the deep recesses of the empire's soul. The forgotten souls were not gone, they had simply been hidden, buried beneath the weight of power and control. They were the ones who had been lost, but they were also the ones who had paid the highest price for an empire that never cared about the cost of its glory. The legacy of the Devshirm system was not one of glory or triumph. It was a legacy steeped in silence and shadows. The Janissaries, forged in the fire of an empire's insatiable need for power, had left behind more than just their bodies on the battlefield. They left behind a silence, a void where their names should have been. For all the empire's victories, for all the glory the Janissaries brought to the Sultan's throne, the price paid was one that would never be acknowledged. The empire had no interest in remembering the boys who had been stolen, who had been remade into warriors. To the empire, they were tools useful, disposable, and easily forgotten once their service was done. Their legacy wasn't carved into stone or enshrined in history books. Instead, it was buried in the hearts of the men who had once been children, who had once been human. The Janissaries, despite their mythic status, had no monuments to their sacrifice. No one spoke their names, no one remembered their pain. The empire that had risen on their backs offered them nothing in return but silence. As the years passed, the empire shifted, grew, and eventually began to crumble under the weight of its own corruption. The Janissaries, like ghosts, haunted the ruins of what had been. They had been discarded, left to fade into nothingness, their stories untold, their sacrifices forgotten. In the silence of their legacy, they became nothing more than whispers in the dark, a footnote in the story of an empire that had never cared to truly know them. What was left of them, after everything had been taken? The men who had once been boys, who had once been stolen and shaped into soldiers, were now empty shells of their former selves. Their memories of the families they had lost had long since faded, replaced by the cold, unyielding loyalty to an empire that had never seen them as anything more than instruments of war. And yet, even in their silence, their legacy remained. It lived in the hearts of the few who still remembered, the ones who saw the Janissaries for what they truly were, not just soldiers, not just warriors, but human beings whose lives had been sacrificed for a cause they never chose. The silence that followed them was not just the absence of sound, it was the absence of recognition, the absence of respect, the absence of any acknowledgement that the Janissaries had ever been real, had ever been more than the empire's shadow. And in that silence, their true legacy lived on. It was a legacy not of war, but of sacrifice, not of glory, but of pain. It was a legacy hidden in the dark corners of history, waiting for someone to finally listen. The echoes of the Janissaries' existence reverberated through time like distant whispers, barely heard, but ever present in the fabric of history. They were the forgotten ones, the shadows that walked through centuries, their stories untold, their sacrifices erased. Yet, their influence lingered in the very bones of the empire they had built, like an unacknowledged debt that could never be repaid. The empire had risen to unimaginable heights because of them, because of the boys who had been stolen, forced to become the empire's soldiers, its enforcers. And yet, with each conquest, with each victory won, the Janissaries were left behind, their humanity left to fade into oblivion. The empire flourished, but it was built on the pain of those who had given their lives, their childhoods, their very identities for a cause they never chose. And in the years that followed, long after the empire's power began to crumble, the Janissaries' legacy lived on in the echoes, faint but undeniable. Those who had once been children, stolen from their homes and reshaped by an empire, had become something else, something the world had forgotten to truly understand. They had become the embodiment of sacrifice, of loyalty, of a power that could never be fully realized because it had been stripped from them in the most brutal of ways. Their names were lost, their faces faded, but the reverberations of their lives, the toll they had paid, echoed through time. It was a quiet, haunting sound, a reminder of what had been taken and never returned. Even in the modern world, where the empire had long since dissolved into history, the silence of the Janissaries' existence could still be felt. The children who had been stolen had shaped the world, but their names were nothing but ghosts. What remained was a legacy of power and loss, a cycle that had repeated itself again and again, a reminder of the cost of empire building. The empire may have fallen, but the echoes of those it had consumed could not be erased. They lived on in the fabric of history, in the empty spaces left behind by those who had been taken, in the silence that followed them. Even as the centuries passed, the empire's ghosts haunted. The world haunted those who had never known the true cost of its power. The echoes of the Janissaries were everywhere, in every conquest, in every empire built on the backs of those who could never fight for themselves. And as time went on, the question still lingered in the air. What price had they truly paid for the empire's glory? It was a question that would never be fully answered, for the Janissaries' legacy was one of silence, one of stories left untold, of lives that had been lost and forgotten. But their echoes remained, and perhaps that was enough to ensure they would never be completely gone. Breaking the silence was never easy. For centuries, the Janissaries' story had been buried beneath the weight of empire and time, forgotten by history and ignored by the world that had benefited from their sacrifices. But as the echoes of their lives grew louder, there was a growing sense of something shifting, something deep within the silence that had once confined them. The world had moved on, the empire long fallen, but the memories of those lost lives, the pain, and the unspoken truths began to stir once more. There were whispers, faint at first, but gradually growing in strength. Survivors of the empire's long reach, those who had seen the Janissaries for what they truly were, began to speak. They told stories of the stolen boys, of the childhoods lost in the darkness of Istanbul's imperial walls, of the men who had been forged from their broken pasts into the most fearsome warriors the world had known. These were the voices that had been silenced for so long, and now they began to break free, clawing their way into the open, into the light of a new world that had no place for the forgotten. They told of how the Janissaries had been forced to fight, to kill, to obey, their very essence erased by the empire's grip. They spoke of the rebellion that had simmered in their hearts, the resistance that had flickered like a dying flame, never to burn bright enough to set the world alight, but enough to remind them of what they had lost. And in those stories, something powerful began to rise. It was as if the Janissaries, once hidden in the shadows of history, were finally finding their voice. The silence that had surrounded them for so long was slowly being broken, piece by piece, until it was no longer a wall but a fissure in the fabric of the empire's myth. The stories began to spread, reaching those who had never known the true cost of the empire's glory, those who had never been told the price of expansion and power. The Janissaries' history, one of sacrifice, of pain, of loyalty and loss, began to be told not by the empire, but by the men who had lived it. It was not a story of victory or triumph, but one of survival, of lives stolen and remade into something unrecognizable. The empire had built itself on their backs, but they had never been acknowledged, never truly understood. Now, however, their voices could be heard. And with each word spoken, the silence that had bound them for so long began to crumble, giving way to the truth that had been hidden beneath layers of time, beneath layers of power. For the Janissaries, breaking the silence was not about revenge. It was about reclaiming their story, their humanity, and most importantly, their place in history. The silence had been deafening, but now it was being shattered, not with violence or force, but with truth. The true cost of empire was never measured in gold or land. It was measured in the lives that were lost, the souls that were consumed, the identities that were erased. For the Janissaries, the price of empire was paid in silence, in the slow erosion of everything that made them human. They were not born warriors, not born soldiers. They were boys, once full of life, with families and futures of their own. But the empire took them, forced them into a mold they never chose, and in doing so, it robbed them of the one thing that could have made their lives meaningful: freedom. The empire grew, its borders expanded, and its wealth flowed. But it did so at the expense of those who had been sacrificed to build it. The Janissaries were tools, nothing more than weapons forged from broken childhoods, yet the cost they paid was not just in their bodies or their time, it was in their very souls. They fought not for their families, not for their homes, but for a sultan who had never cared for them, for a power that saw them as nothing but instruments to be used and discarded. As the empire grew, so did the cost. More boys were taken, more lives were destroyed, more names were lost. And with each conquest, the Janissaries' humanity faded further, replaced by the cold obedience that the empire demanded. They had become nothing more than ghosts in the machine of imperial power, their lives written off as mere casualties of war, their sacrifices unacknowledged by the very empire that had risen on their backs. The true cost of empire was not in the wealth it amassed, nor in the land it conquered, but in the broken lives it left behind. The Janissaries were the forgotten cost, the hidden price of a glory that had come at too great a sacrifice. They had given everything to the empire, everything they had ever known, everything they had ever loved, but in the end, the empire gave them nothing in return. Their loyalty had been bought with blood, their service had been demanded by force, and when they were no longer needed, they were discarded. The empire's hunger for power had consumed them, and in the end, it had consumed itself. The true cost of empire could never be calculated in mere figures. It was felt in the emptiness left behind by those who had been stolen, reshaped, and then forgotten. The empire thrived, yes, but the cost of that triumph was a debt that could never be paid. The Janissaries had been its most loyal servants, but in the end, they were nothing more than casualties of a power that never stopped to consider the price it had exacted. As the years passed, the legacy of the Janissaries became a story of reflection, one that the world had forgotten to tell. Their name, once feared across empires, now lived only in whispers in faded pages of history. The empire that had used them to build its power was long gone, and yet the echoes of their lives, the pain, the sacrifice, the transformation, still lingered, waiting to be acknowledged. These were the men who had once been boys, stolen from their homes, and made to serve a foreign power, and now, in their absence, the world was left to reckon with the price of their lives. What had the empire gained from them? Glory? Power? Yes, but at what cost? The Janissaries had given their youth, their families, their identities, and in return, the empire had offered them nothing but silence. History had erased their names, their stories lost in the weight of conquest and empire building. And yet, even in the silence, something powerful remained. The Janissaries had been the heart of the empire, the warriors who had forged its path, but they were also the forgotten ones, the ones who had been used and discarded once their purpose had been served. Their legacy wasn't one of power or victory. It was a legacy of sacrifice, of lives lost in the service of something that never cared about the cost. The empire had thrived, but the men who had fought for it had been left to fade, their memories buried beneath the weight of imperial glory. Now, years later, as the empire's shadow faded into history, the question lingered: what had the Janissaries left behind? They had left behind a legacy of broken lives, of children turned into soldiers, of men who had been forced to serve without ever knowing freedom. They had left behind a truth that could never be erased, no matter how much time passed. The empire that had stolen their childhoods, that had stripped them of their names, was gone, but the cost of its rise was still felt. The legacy of the Janissaries was not in the battles they won, but in the lives they lost, the human cost of power that could never be fully accounted for. And in that legacy, there was a lesson, one that would echo through time, that power built on the backs of the innocent could never be free of its price. The Janissaries, though forgotten by history, had paid that price. Their legacy was one of sacrifice, and though the world had moved on, it was a legacy that could never be silenced, never be erased. They had been the tools of empire, yes, but they had also been the forgotten victims of it. Their lives forever marked by the power they had served, their stories forever lost, yet eternally lingering in the echoes of the empire's rise. The legacy of the Devshirme system reminds us that history is often told by those in power, but the truth belongs to the forgotten. These children, stolen from their families, turned into soldiers and servants, paid a price that we must never forget. Their story is a dark chapter in history that continues to shape our world today. If you've been moved by their struggle, remember, the past is not truly gone. It's only forgotten until we choose to remember. Subscribe and stay with us as we uncover more lost stories and let the forgotten voices rise once more.